we have a lot to learn about how we can systematize what we think is beautiful behavior for each other. That might get us closer to what we think is a system that would best fit who we are.
I think it's really fascinating how when you kind of look at things in detail, we work with systems every day, whether we kind of realize it or not, want to or not.
We tend to look outside for answers. We're like, hey, how do we find which textbook is going to give me the answer to life? You know, not a textbook, then maybe someone else. So, welcome to the Level Up With Us podcast, where we talk about amazing perspective shifts that we've had over the course of our lives on specific topics to help you understand that there is more than one way out of any situation that you might find yourself in. Today, we have an amazing guest, Marcus, who was brought here by Jessica. Jessica, yes. If you want to give like a quick intro of Marcus before we throw it to him to give his dynamic, bombastic intro, maybe you can go ahead and give him a little bit of the fanfare.
I'm taking a bioethics class this semester. I met Marcus in class, and we're actually going to do a presentation together. But during our conversations, I thought that Marcus would have very interesting perspective to share. And he also kind of trained in philosophy. So I was like, would you be interested in a podcast? And he said yes, and here we are.
Here we are. And we're going to talk about a topic today, which is all about systems, right? And our perspective on them. Are they useful? When are they helpful? I think these are all the things we'll explore. Marcus, please take it away. Give us your introduction. Who are you? Where you're from? And what do you care about systems? What does it mean to you?
So yeah, thanks for having me on board. I really appreciate the invite to be here. Just as a quick introduction, my name is Marcus. I am a Singaporean philosopher. Wow. I am presently a PhD student at the Yong Lulin School of Medicine under the Center for Biomedical Ethics. So I specialize really in some areas of applied or practical ethics. Of course, at present, I spend most of my time doing biomedical ethics. Wow. So when it comes to systems, I think there's something super interesting about systems because they seem to have an uncanny ability to make or break something, which seems to be a little bit strange because it seems like more often than not, we're talking about people breaking systems or making up these systems, and we think that they're super arbitrary.
Absolutely.
But I'm going to give you the most philosopher cop-out here. And I'm just going to say that there are times in which systems are great, and there are times in which systems are not great. And I think that there's something really interesting to have, at least conversationally, to think about when it comes to when systems are great and when they're not.
Yes. No, and thank you so much, Marcus, for saying that, because I think what we tend to do as humans is we tend to latch onto ideas, and then once we find something that works for us, we're like, oh, this will work for every situation we find ourselves in, and let's apply the system everywhere. And I think as we find out, as we kind of hit these roadblocks, it's like, hey, that's not true, right? This system doesn't apply everywhere.
Yep. You're right. I think there are many examples of systems that might not work universally. So I think one system that might be interesting is actually some sort of social security system. So for example, in biomedical ethics, we think a lot about the distribution of scarce resource. Right. And when it comes to the distribution of scarce resources, we understand that different communities might have very different reactions to systemic distributions of resource.
Yes.
Depending on how egalitarian a society is, depending on how collectivistic, individualistic, what have you, there's so many different metrics on which a society might be judged. These societies might draw very different reactions to how scarce resources are distributed. And we see the exact phenomenon happening with COVID. Right? We were thinking a lot about how to redistribute ventilators, for example.
Sure.
Is there a prioritarian need to make sure that the elderly had access to ventilators, or is there some sort of greater collectivistic need to say that, well, maybe the elderly shouldn't be granted priority for ventilators because they have the least amount of time left.
Right.
Which is, a brutally efficient way to do it.
Yes.
So not everyone's going to agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think many ethicists would step out to say, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that, right? Shouldn't be thinking of human lives that way. So that's just one example of how, I think systems can be viewed very differently, just, having the same system, but in different communities. I think that's one way.
Absolutely. And I think there's so much to talk about on this even because I think one thing that we tend to do when we build systems is that we build it for a certain demographic. We don't necessarily know how it will affect the different demographics as we start becoming more of a globalized world.
Mm.
And I think the worst case of this is usually when the US kind of comes in and says like, hey, we found this way that works, right? And I'm thinking it's out of goodwill. I like to think of everything as goodwill, right? It's like, hey, try this. This will help your country. This will help your society.
Okay.
And no, it's not, because maybe their cultural norms are different. They value different things. Like you said,
Right.
maybe some cultures value the younger generation. Maybe some cultures value the older generation, right?
Yep.
And you have to really figure out like the nuance of those traditions that they might have before applying a system like unilaterally, in my opinion. And did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Jess?
I mean, when you were explaining about your version of the systems, it just came to mind that when we look at public systems that, for everyone to use is very different from how, or at least how I think of other private systems, like what I myself would use. And is it correct, or is it a logical way to kind of think that for a lot of public systems, they mainly focus on like what's most economical, like what could help everybody? But for our personal systems, maybe we can look at like from an economic aspect too, but I would think it's more values based, or really based on like what we think is important, and then that's how we design the systems.
Yeah, I think in all cases, we cannot shy away from fiscal considerations or economic considerations, right? So from a public-private sector perspective, certainly it's business. You have to be sustainable in that sense. Now, from a more public-personal values space, I think it's completely rational to consider personal values that make sense for you, or like reacting to your values in a way that's financially responsible, right? So I think we can take that out of the equation, right? Because it seems to me to be a common denominator. But I think something really interesting arises in this kind of dichotomy between the public and the private when we're thinking about the duties that we owe to each other. And I think, so maybe one way to hijack this entire podcast would be to say, well, here's a moral system, right? Like, and I'm an ethicist, so perhaps that's where my biases lie.
Sure.
But moral systems are precisely that, right? We think about how we ought to interact with each other. We are not concerned just with how we presently interact with each other, right? That's an empirical kind of endeavor that we kind of outsource to the behavioral sciences or the social sciences. But philosophers are really interested in how we ought to behave with each other, and I think that's what interests me the most.
Yeah, I think it's really fascinating how when you kind of look at things in detail, we work with systems every day, whether we kind of realize it or not, want to or not. There are just things that, every day is just pervasive with systems. And I think that is just very mind-blowing to realize sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think something that we don't end up thinking enough about is like, we benefit from systems and we don't really think about how we benefit until we don't have that benefit. I think that is like very true to fact, because we tend to, like, the way I would see it actually, and even adding to your point earlier, is that we have so many different types of systems that were initially created for personal gain, but eventually it moved towards what is good for society. How do we help people work together? And that's the best way I like to look at systems too. That to me is like the best definition, is like a system is something that makes multiple groups of people come together and get something done. The easiest way to think about it is money, right? Money has helped so many people get things done. And to me, that is, people sometimes say some of it is a broken concept, right? Like the way we deal with money today, there's so many things we can discuss about that, I'm sure. But I also think that there is a very good case for like, hey, how do we build systems that actually are, suitable for this current day society? And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. So what you mentioned is actually a super interesting thing that political philosophers have thought about for the longest time, right? So we're looking back to, even the forefathers of what we view as Western civilized society. If we think about, the kind of classic political philosophers, I'm thinking of people like John Locke, people like Thomas Hobbes.
Right.
These were people who actually said very similar things to what you just said.
Yeah.
So congratulations, you're a political philosopher now.
Wonderful.
So they were concerned with what we call the state of nature.
Mhm.
Right. And a lot of these philosophers at that point of time had different views or different presumptions of what humanity would be like
Mhm.
if we hadn't gotten together to form societies and communities.
Yes.
And that's, of course, what you mentioned remind me of. So I don't know if it was Hobbes or Locke, but there's this idea that human life in the state of nature would be nasty, brutish, and short.
Okay.
So that's what they that was one of the most famous extrapolations of what we would be like if we hadn't gotten together to form communities, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, there are other philosophers. I think Rousseau was a very famous one who thought that, well, maybe the state of nature is not that bad because we would inadvertently, as a eusocial species, come together to form social contracts. So there are philosophers who disagree a lot here. And the main thing here is that what all of these philosophers then point to is the formation of these systems that we call society and community.
Okay.
And in the formation of these systems, we see that there are certain perks that we cannot do without right now. Like the world that we think about right now would not exist if not for these perks.
Absolutely.
So one glaring example is law, right? We got together, we decided that there were certain things that we didn't want to accept or certain things that we deemed completely obligatory of each other.
Yeah.
And we kind of encoded them and we decided that this was how we're going to live our lives as a eusocial co-living kind of species.
Sure.
So obviously laws change, right? Just as how our moral systems change.
Yeah.
And that just reflects how systems have to be, in this sense, flexible to evolving ideas. Just like how I think in the past, there was a time where everyone got together and accepted that homosexuality is a sin.
Sure.
Right. And then we see that more and more, this is not something that the common kind of consciousness accepts anymore. So yeah, that's one way we can really think about how systems really came about, because it's really beneficial to us as a eusocial species.
Yeah.
Now, something that I would also like to bring up was that you did mention a kind of dichotomy between individual interests and this communal kind of interests.
Sure.
So something super interesting here is that we are still divided on whether that's even the case.
Okay.
Some philosophers would say that there's no such thing as a truly communal interest. We came into communities because of individual interests.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah,
because
you can say it that way.
Yeah, in the state of nature, if life is nasty, brutish, and short, I have an interest not to have a nasty, brutish, and short life.
Yeah.
So, and you have that interest too, presumably. So we all come together and we make sure that our lives are not nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah.
So then all of these communal things that we do, egalitarianism, altruism, these are, according to these philosophers, purely self-interested.
Okay.
Right. And of course, there are philosophers out there who think otherwise.
Sure.
Yeah.
I love that you're on this track, Marcus, because I think there's so much I want to talk about here. Because I've thought about this a lot too. And I think many of the philosophers you've named, I actually do base a lot of my work on, right? And specifically, one thing that I've observed is there is, I think, a different lens that we can see this versus like movement that we had through different social organizations that we ended up creating. So the way I see it is like this: like when we first are born, like you said, we're super brutish. We want to just feed ourselves, relieve ourselves. Like that's all we want in the world. We're all about survival. That's all that matters to us. There's nothing else, right? So we're not even thinking about other people. We just like, hey, there's food. I'm going to hunt it. I'm going to eat it. Eventually realized that wasn't enough, right? We need to sleep. We have bodily needs that we need someone to cover us. So we banded together in tribes to say, hey, I'm going to depend on you so that you can go ahead and, watch my back and I'll watch yours, right? But very much self-interested, right?
Yep.
I'm only doing that for you because I know you'll do that for me so that we can all survive. But other than that, the tribe is just, it's just for survival, right? Then the next stage, I think, is we start looking about like, okay, our basic needs are kind of met. Now what are our wants, right? And when we go to want things, no one's helping us for that. Like nobody really is there to help you get your wants. They're here to help you get your needs, maybe if you think about social welfare and those kind of things.
Yep.
But getting your wants is like a very like, okay, you want that? Go get it yourself, right? For the most part. Even if your parents, right? Your parents don't like what you want is not what your parents want, most likely.
Yep.
Right. So that's where we kind of go. But then what we realize is that movement away from the tribe scares us because we are individuals that like belonging, right? So then we go and find tribes that are like us. We tend to leave our tribes and go to tribes that are like, okay, these are people that will all want the same thing. So then we're all going to get these wants together. And this is when we start having nation states, right? That's when we start having like, religious groups and those kinds of things. Hey, we all believe in this one thing. We're all going to work together. But again, for the collective mission, right? It's still not necessarily for the community, but as for a community that I belong to. So it's still very much me focused, right?
Yep.
And then what we notice is that we shifted then to systems, right? We're like, okay, now we have different, religious groups kind of warring. We have different, groups that like are very single-minded, but we still need them to organize in a united nation, right?
Yep.
So what are the different structures that we can put in to make everyone work together? Capitalism came in, right, as an answer. Communism came in as another answer, right? Some had failed, some had successes, right? But they came in to try to systematize the whole thing. But again, I think today specifically, we see a lot of people kind of leave those structures, right? How many friends do we know that like say like, hey, I don't want to be part of this, right? Get me out. I'm going to Bali, right? And then they just like completely disregard the systems that are created because they don't think it's set up for them. And you can't, right? Like we just said, the system, if you build a system for everyone, there's always someone left out, right? So then they strive to create their own system, like their own, hippie communities and everything. And we see that all the time nowadays, especially as we get more disillusioned with what society has been. But what's really interesting and what I'm currently studying now is how do we move beyond that, right? What is the next step? We're all disillusioned, certainly with systems, right? But what is the right systems that we need to create? What is a system that we can all tolerate and accept? What are the rules that we need to have in place? Like, hey, don't kill someone. Yeah, okay, I probably want to follow that one, right? Like, which ones do we want to follow? Which ones do we not follow, right? And even when people don't follow those rules, right? We set these boundaries and people still cross them. How do we then still include them in our societies, right? And be curious about it. It's like, hey, you know what? I said don't kill people. You just keep killing people. Like you've killed 40 people now. What do you want, right? And should you be angry? Should you put them on death row? Or should you, be curious? Like, wait, what makes you the way you are, right? And I just wonder at the end of all this, like, is there a society where we can truly be empathetic and accepting and loving of all these different people? And again, to bridge it all together, like, I think my take on it is it's, yes, all self-interested, but the self-interest is parsed through a lens of how you see the world then. Is it for me for survival? Is it for me for my wants, right? Because we're grouping together to get that. Is it for me to work with other groups that I kind of want their stuff too? Like, hey, I'm Christian, let's say, and they're Muslim and I still want to trade with them. Like, I need something to deal with that, right? And so that's the way I kind of see it. And I'm really curious, like, what's your take on kind of that, breakdown that I have? Oh, this episode is proudly supported by the Coast3 Family Foundation, and specifically our philosophies over at the.x3.family. If you care a lot about thinking about the world and how you might interact with it, and all the different ways that you could possibly think about a situation, different perspectives that you might have throughout your life, different ways that you might interact with different people, depending on what stage of acceptance they are in a different understanding of situations that they're in, and also like how you interact with your wants in life, right? What do you want and how do you go get them? Why should everyone study philosophy? Maybe that is
okay. I think the most succinct way I put it is it structures our thoughts in ways that are meaningful, in ways that are choice-worthy, and the most conducive for how we ought to live our lives.
I love it. Oh yeah, so if you want to check that out, please check out our philosophies over at the.x3.family. And back to the episode.
I think the self-interested thing is also something that I'm not sure how strong of an opinion I have on that.
Okay.
Precisely because look, like you can say that so suppose, for example, right, here's just an example. I have an interest that my mother is not sad. Now, this interest is something that I hold. So if my mother is not sad, it'll be good for me.
Sure, absolutely.
Right. But why do I hold this interest? It's because I have a eusocial, bond, some sort of investment social investment in the welfare of my mother.
Yes.
That could be seen as something completely altruistic.
Sure.
Right. Or if you were super pessimistic about things, you would be like, well, no, that's just the norm of reciprocity coming in, right?
Or maybe you want an inheritance. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So you could be that. Like, you could be a bad person and or you're only motivated by inheritance. But things like the norm of reciprocity is something that I think is super interesting, because filial piety could be something that just arose from reciprocity. If we are grateful to our parents for giving us good lives, good upbringings, for providing for us, and we see that as something praiseworthy, and we want to act on that praiseworthiness, then it seems like I would have formed this eusocial relationship with my mother or your parents, and therefore you would have legitimate moral interests in their interests.
Sure.
Right. So you have this second order interest. So then it seems like the line blurs between a fully self-serving interest and some sort of altruistic interest.
Okay.
Right. That's one thing to note. And I think as time has gone by, it's not something it's not something that's been super well studied, I think. Not that I know of. I'm sure that perhaps some psychologists, sociologists, or anthropologists out there might have better answers than I would. I can't claim to be an expert in this field. So there's that, right? I think we can't, or at least I can't, really negotiate this bent really well between kind of the complete self-interest and altruistic interest. And obviously there's going to be some hybrid account out there. But one thing that I'd be super interested in is, you're right, as we all age, as we all progress, as humanity ages, right? We have seen communities rise and fall. We've seen so many different changes. One really good way to think about it, I think, is through the lens of social justice. And a favorite example that I bring up is always the suffragettes, right? If it weren't for them going out to do what would be socially disruptive to systems, we would not be where we are today.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, women would not be allowed to vote. They won't be able to do all the great things that women are able to do and have done. Same thing goes for the likes of Martin Luther King Jr.
Sure.
Right. So there is a promise, or at the very least an appeal to the permissibility or even choice-worthiness of sometimes breaking that exact system that we've all come together to accept and agree to live by, right? And sometimes these systems are a matter of export. Whether we like it or not, colonial times were exactly
I mean, we're a product of our history, certainly.
Exactly, right? So the fact that I speak English as my first language in a Southeast Asian country, being born and raised in a Southeast Asian country, is precisely because of colonialism, right? So whether or not we accept these systems it seems to be something that becomes a product or a function of the times that we live in as well, especially with the age of the internet and information. It also becomes a product or function of the world and the state of the world. And you're right, I think more and more youth nowadays are being more and more disillusioned about the state of the world today.
I think putting it a bit simpler there, because absolutely I agree with you. I think simply put, though, is that the laws and the structure and the system, let's say, is set up for the constituents of that country, let's say, even Singapore, right? The laws were fit for the people of Singapore then. But as a globalized world starts coming into the picture, as more different demographics come in, as different, people of different sexual orientations come in, Singapore's got to make a choice. Like, hey, is it economically advantageous for Singapore as a country, right? Or even on a longevity point of view, right? To include these people as part of their purview, right? And once you include people that were not traditionally part of your social structure, and you need to start making new rules to fit their class, right? And new benefits to help them survive in the country that you set up, then to me, that's when you come inside and say, hey, you know what? Systems aren't good for me. I'm going to let go of all this, right? I don't want to be involved. And if I do want to be involved, these are the boundaries I'd like to set so that I can come in and actually engage as an equal standing member of your community, right? And I think that's where a lot of at least for me, the system start and ends, right? Like you will always rebuild a new system. You will always need to kind of change as the times change. But to me, it's always about who are you serving with that system. And I love that you brought up suffrage movements. I love that you brought up, Martin Luther King, because I think those are actually like very good examples of like, hey, you know what? Obviously, the system was set up for certain people to really enjoy life.
Yep.
And if you want a better life for all, right, different systems need to play. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. And something that came to mind is really a lot of really pessimistic modern day philosophers are looking at these systems and they just kind of throw their hands up in the air and they're like, well, these systems are necessarily just there for self-sustenance. And these systems kind of function as their own organisms at this point.
Sure.
So I'm thinking very loosely about some, philosophers who are still alive today, like Slavoj Žižek, I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
Sorry. But yeah, so these systems are self-sustaining, right? They operate in a way that's meant for their own perpetuation. There's this kind of ceaseless cycle that goes on, and these systems tend to be, I understand that X number of people or a sufficient number of people have raised concerns about this thing, but if I were to do that, that leads to certain other problems here. And so systems have grown to the point of no return, first of all, where we cannot imagine what the world would be like without these systems. Now, that's not to say that these systems are completely unamenable to change.
Yeah.
Right. But I think it's fair to say that we cannot imagine what the world would be like without these systems. And when we think about how these systems are really meant to perpetuate themselves, we see that suddenly what comes into the equation as the biggest driver of change is power, which is in itself a very, very loaded term in social philosophy.
Absolutely.
Right. You have not just political power, but also social power from these social movements that we've just mentioned. The suffragettes did see a large following, which then granted them so much power, which then granted, progress in gender equality. So I think there's this really interesting tension, right, between the power that leads to the self-perpetuation and the cyclical nature of these systems that we talk about, and also the power that's necessary for change in those systems.
But while you guys were talking, a common theme that kind of came to me was that maybe there are very long-lived systems, but I am increasingly growing to think that there are no systems that really last forever. Like there's a limit to its longevity. And I think for myself, I'm realizing that it's either a lot of factors come together, like operational or logistical factors that come together, and then you realize the systems don't work anymore. Or like the examples you guys mentioned is that more and more people decide that, hey, this system doesn't work for me. I want to build a new one, or band together with other people to build a new one. And then that's when you get new systems. And then that kind of reminds me of this, I don't know if it's a quote, but they said that ideas or like concepts don't change until the previous generation dies.
Yep.
Right. So it kind of got me to thinking that when do we know that it's time to change the system? Like we have to make sure that systems are flexible and adaptable, right? But how easy or how difficult is it to kind of realize that?
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on that. Too many for this episode. but I wanted to say one thing. Like this reminds me of a very funny social commentary that I've seen before. Have any of you guys watched Rick and Morty?
Yep.
Okay, so do you know the episode where basically there's this planet and their answer to solving people's frustrations about the government and everything is having one day to purge, basically.
Right.
So every day, one day, like of the whole year, they will just kill each other, shoot each other, and then that'll get rid of all their, anxiety and anger about everything, and they can, revenge on anyone they want. They can steal the money they want. Like no crime is legal, right? So that's the situation that this planet is in. So our main characters, Rick and Morty, basically go to this planet and they're like, hey, this kind of sucks. And they accidentally go there on this right day that everyone's killing each other. So they get involved in the brawl and they start killing the heads of states that were like organizing and like sipping their wine while, everyone's like all the peasants are killing each other. And then so they got rid of the government, right? They got rid of the people who were perpetuating this thing and making everything seem so unequal for everyone. And then so now the peasants are like, okay, now what do we do, right? They're like, oh, I guess I will want to eat. And then someone's like, I have bread. I can give you bread. It's like, yeah, okay, I'll give you sheep. I don't want sheep. And then someone says, I can give you something that represents, money so that you guys can exchange. And then someone's like, oh, I can take care of that. And it's like, hey, how come you get to take care of that? I want to take care of that too. And then it became like a whole thing where they just rebuilt society in exactly the same way. Nothing has changed, right? And then they're back in the same thing. And then they're like, and then they start arguing. And then literally a minute later, it's like, how should we deal with our arguments? What if we had one day that we would just kill each other? So it's so funny. I think absolutely to what you're saying, right? The old guard, so to speak, hasn't changed. We think of the old guard as the government, as the people in charge, but actually it's the people, right? We all are part of the system. We all are using the system in some way. And even if the system died tomorrow, we will still rebuild it in almost the same fashion, right? Yeah. So we just need to actually figure out what actually needs to change. What is the actual thing that we need to tweak to make things more equal, right? If that's the goal, right? To make things more beneficial to the people who are involved and to make sure that, the complete system, again, nothing's perfect. I don't aim to have a perfect system. Everyone is captured under the sun. We are not there yet, maybe someday, right? But how do we actually create something that is useful for, nth percentage of the population?
Right. So actually the purge is a wonderful thought experiment. So obviously we're leaving at the door the empirical claim, right? That a purge-like thing would actually be helpful for society because that's an empirical claim and I'm not qualified to check. Sure. Neither would I hope that anyone's qualified to check. But so there's a normative claim here. I think I think the normative value of looking at the purge is precisely why it's so interesting to us. Why are we so fascinated with this idea? Rick and Morty were not the first.
Oh, they're not the first. No, right? Absolutely not.
There was literally a movie called The Purge.
Yes, exactly.
Right, on that exact premise. And I'm sure that there are enough dystopian novels out there that had similar premises before the movie.
Yes, absolutely.
So why are we fascinated with these things? And I think the main thing about why these things stick out to us is because they refused, or rather they kind of infringe upon, I would say, our moral intuitions in the most direct fashion, while at the same time, there is an underlying presumption that the thing that caused your moral intuition to go haywire is completely legal. Right. And when we think about it that way, it seems now we come to this very, very common issue of this divorce between legality and morality, which is where we get into a lot of debates again, because it's what we do for a living. Sure. So I'm of the view that legality tracks morality. Okay. And so to kind of keep in line with whatever you were just saying, legality represents this system that we're talking about. We're building systems for the people, for nth percentage of people, for whoever it's meant to protect or serve. Yes. And so my answer here would be that legality tracks morality. And if you're thinking about, what's the best way we can universally, as much as possible, cater to to different groups of people within a larger international community, my answer would be moral philosophy, right? Because that's precisely what the project is. Now, I must preface here that moral philosophy obviously is a large field, and not all moral philosophers are interested in political philosophy. Sure. You mentioned things like equality, right? There are different accounts of what equality even means.
Absolutely.
Right? Is justice fairness? So a lot of people would reject this idea, actually, even though it's really intuitive to think that justice is fairness. It's also open to some counter arguments. But what I'm more interested in is really how do we treat each other, right? Yeah. Because bringing back to what you said, I think a few comments ago, we came together like, hey, you have this interest, I have this interest, you scratch your back. Oh, I scratch your back. No, wait. Yeah, I got that wrong. You scratch my back and I scratch your back.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's again to bring back the idea of moral philosophy being something that kind of explores through analyses and meditation what is the best way we ought to treat each other. Now, just to go on a slight tangent, we also refer to moral philosophy as ethics. Right,
sure.
which actually came from the word aesthetics. The word aesthetics came from the word, I'm not gonna butcher the pronunciation, but it came from the Greek word for beautiful. What is beautiful, right? Or the study of beauty.
Sure.
And outside of the study of beauty, not just visual or sensory beauty, but also beauty of behavior and beauty of state of affairs.
Sure.
That's where ethics as we know it, as we currently know it, comes out.
Yeah.
And so what we might be really interested in here is the beauty of, or what comprises a beautiful action.
Yes.
To put it very poetically.
Yeah.
And obviously, again, philosophers cannot agree on what's the right view in moral philosophy. I'm not sure if this is the appropriate place for me to spread my propaganda on the right view in moral philosophy, so I shan't. But I think that they all, the reason why they've withstood the test of time is because they have a lot of good going for them.
Sure.
And I think irrespective of what your view is in moral philosophy, we have a lot to learn about how we can systematize what we think is beautiful behavior for each other.
Yes.
And that might get us closer to what we think is a system that would best fit who we are.
I think this will be a great moment to kind of go to the whiteboard and kind of explain what we've all drawn, because I think this is probably going to help wrap everything. So maybe, Jess, you want to explain your matrix first?
I think for me, systems has always been quite clear and helpful. I think what I want is smiley face happy. So then depending on what variables I have, X, Y, A, or B, then I can be in one quadrant. So I guess it can be different worlds because I can choose a different action in different worlds. But I think why systems have been so helpful for me is that when it helps me to kind of decide or get to a conclusion a lot faster than I would have otherwise. But I do have to say that I am still trying to navigate what happens when things fall outside of those variables. So we'll see what happens.
So it's like a heuristic, like almost like a heuristic that helps you make decisions and
Yeah,
helps you get like 80% of the answer right. So
yeah, exactly. So I think it's like a starting point for me to know where to go. And then, of course, the rest of the 20% depends on the situation and what I want at the time.
Got it. Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Marcus?
Okay, so I missed the memo on how, on how large our drawings are meant to be. So I drew the Eye of Sauron because, not because I'm a Lord of the Rings fan, and I'm very sorry to Lord of the Rings fans out there. I'm not a fan. But what I was super interested in is the all-seeing eye. And I think that's what a system really is to me. So I was inspired to draw the Eye of Sauron because I was interested in the all-seeing eye. I was interested in more specifically the case or the idea of the panopticon, right? The panopticon is a thought experiment that was brought up by classical utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and later then kind of extrapolated upon by Michel Foucault. The idea is that the system is the all-seeing eye. Now, the panopticon works by being a structure of a prison. I'm not sure if you've heard of the panopticon. So Jeremy Bentham, being a utilitarian, really wanted to make the world's most efficient prison because it would maximize utility. The prison would be like a donut, right? Just imagine from the top view, you've got a donut. Now, in the middle ring, instead of a ring, you've got a tower. And that tower is covered in one-way glass, right? And the outer ring, it's all prisoners whose cells face the inner tower.
Okay.
Right? So why was the panopticon so important symbolically was that we realized that number one, the prisoners could not interact with each other because the only people were directly next to you and you're separated by cell walls, which is not the biological term, but I mean like literal walls of a cell. And number two, I think most importantly, you would never know when you're under surveillance because it's a one-way mirror. The idea is that, well, Jeremy Bentham's idea was that, well, you could only have one guard in that prison and everyone would behave.
Sure.
Now, the reason he thought this was that we would internalize surveillance. And he thought that it was just a self-evident psychological trait, which I think now is something that's empirically defensible or not, I don't know. But I thought it was super interesting because systems tend to be that way. As I mentioned, I think systems are self-preserving. They tend to be somewhat cyclical, as you mentioned about the Purge and Rick and Morty. They tend to be cyclical. History tends to repeat itself, and most importantly, they're self-serving. The systems themselves can be self-serving, right?
Sure. They propagate.
They propagate themselves. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you very much for that. So the panopticon is something that I really thought about because a lot of systems that we are exposed to are really a lot like the panopticon. When we go to public schools, Foucault actually called it a prison, like the panopticon, because in public schools you are taught manners, which really is just a way of thinking about self-surveillance. You adjust your behavior in a way that's required of the community, the system that you're in, that's prized or praiseworthy by the system you're in, and then you kind of it kind of gets built into your personality, your character, and that's how it perpetuates itself. Because you grow up to teach that to your children, and then the whole cycle repeats over and over again.
Absolutely.
So I was really interested in this idea of the system perpetuating itself when I was put on the spot to figure out what I think would be a picture of that symbolizes a system for me.
Yeah. I like it. So maybe if I could just recap to make sure I understand properly, because I think it's a big idea, is that you think systems are essentially policing kind of behavior of the people that are inside the system to achieve some sort of outcome, right? Largely to self-propagate, right? You said in the stock market, obviously, the stock market basically gets people to do certain actions to continue having the stock market grow and eventually become something too big to fail, right? Or at least it tries to be. And then in some way, like, I think what I'm seeing from that too is that it's enforcing some sort of rule to the game, right? Like if you think about a game, like it has certain rules, you can do certain things, and it's essentially saying like, hey, you can do X, Y, and Z, and this is the things that will help the structure kind of propagate and like make lives better for the people it's serving, right? Might not be everybody, right? But the people whose lives it's built for. And then essentially like it's all seeing because it's like kind of shining into every aspect of your life.
Yeah, that's kind of it. And I think the most important thing is that it being all seeing is precisely why we internalize it so well. I think even in the absence of these empirical evidence that the panopticon would work, I think it's quite self-evident to me, at least, that we internalize these systems very, very well, which lay testament to how good these systems are at self-propagating. But I should include that see, a lot of discussions on this topic, especially when you summarize it correctly, that I think that systems police and there's this all-seeing eyes, forever gaze on you. When you put it that way, it tends to sound really bad, right? It tends to be that there's unwarranted surveillance, or there is no privacy in the system, or like you do not own your body, and it's a lot of these kind of
a lot of jumps.
A lot of jumps, yeah. So there are a lot of these jumps. Now, I'm not saying that these jumps are legitimate.
Sure.
So in fact, I'm going to talk about the contrary. I think that there are certain cases in which we might think that we have strong, choice-worthy reasons to maintain these systems.
Sure.
So of course we've talked a lot about the perpetuation of the human race, right? So having norms of reciprocity and things like that, we've talked about that already. But we have it seems to me at least that we have reasons to think that humanity would be a lot better with these systems in place.
Sure.
Of course, sometimes the systems fail us, and that's where, as a human race, we have, again, strong reasons to revise these systems.
Yeah.
But I think I agree with a lot of the classical political philosophers that I don't think humanity would be better off in a complete lack of systems. Strangely enough, if we look at the current literature on what anarchy means in philosophy, it's now its own system.
Yeah, yeah.
Which sounds to be ironic, but actually it's a fascinating field.
Yes.
Because anarchy has become a bad word, right? About like disorder and like society crumbling down.
Sure.
But if we actually take seriously the views for a second of philosophical anarchists,
Sure.
they're actually thinking, no, I think the only difference that I think might be better is that I think society should be organized from the bottom up.
Okay.
So that's what to my understanding, of course,
Sure.
I'm not an expert in this, but to my understanding, that's what anarchy has become. And I think it's a fascinating idea because these are people who think that, the more we place people in power and the more our system kind of rewards that kind of cycle,
Sure.
the worse off humanity becomes.
Possible.
And it's entirely possible. And I think that view suddenly becomes a lot more enticing than what we initially thought about this whole V for Vendetta kind of anarchy, isn't it?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that there are possible worlds, if we look at the grid again, of very, very vastly different values. And when I mean value, I mean like positive or negative value of how good that world is, depending on how that world is organized.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe now to like speak to what I put on the board too, like I think we live our life very much at the beginning of our life anyway, looking for answers, right? And we tend to look outside for answers. We're like, hey, how do we find which textbook is going to give me the answer to life? Which textbook is going to give me all the answers that I want to know, like how to be happy, how to be a better person, et cetera, et cetera. Like we think a textbook is going to give us everything, and if not a textbook, then maybe someone else, right? We ask someone, it's like, hey, how did you get there? And and then once we start asking other people, then we start asking the system, like, hey, how does this system reward me so that I can get the life that I want? But I think what we learn nowadays is that the best answers come from within. Right. That's why I put like outside answers then come to inside answers. Because like you said, like very well, is that actually through meditation, we actually learn so much, right? We know so much more inside ourselves than we think. And of course, you don't get there until you actually, go outside, look at what else out there, then you go inside, which is why I think it's like a loop, right?
Yep.
But once you go inside, then you go outside again and you see like, hey, I've learned something different about me. I don't think I'm being served by this system, that's for example. Then how do I go and make change a system, right? Or go to another place that has a system that I want, right? Because the world is still, somewhat,
Yeah, I think that's actually what you've done is you've effectively summarized what I do for a living.
Wow. So this suddenly got really, really deep, and Marcus actually jumped into a lot of meaningful sharing about how he's using philosophy in his life to really help make life better for him. And one of the philosophies we ended up talking a lot in depth about was the philosophy of happiness and how we can consistently get happiness in our life so that we are putting ourselves in a position to get sustainable forms of happiness and how we can consistently pursue it to live a better life. So if you want to check that out, we're going to have that episode out next week. So stay tuned. And with that, we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.